Welcome to this seminar. I'm Micaela Moreira. I'm a fellow here at CLACS, and along with Richard Smith, that is also a visiting fellow at CLACS, we organized this online seminar that is called 50 Years of Social Movements. And we would like to thank CLACS for supporting this initiative, and we will hope that this will continue to draw attention to the existing field of social movements and build dialogues across disciplines and territories. So we are going to have 4 very interesting presentations today. The first will be by Gabriel Bayarri. He's a Newton International Fellow here at CLACS. He will be discussing how mimetic images are core components to understand the logic of far-right movements in Latin America. The next speaker will be Lilija Alijeva. She's a researcher at the University of London Institute in Paris. She will focus on the roles of minorities in social movements and political developments involving domestic and external actors by addressing the case of Russian-speaking minorities in both Latvia and Estonia. Later on, we will hear the work of Richard Smith, our co-organizer as well. He is also a visiting fellow at CLACS and an honorary fellow at the Department of History of the University of Liverpool, and will be presenting the findings of his more recent research on the Chilean student movement during Pinochet's dictatorship. Finally, we will have a joint presentation from Sam Halvorsen. He's a senior lecturer in human geography at Queen Mary University of London, and also Nicolás Angelcos. He's a professor at the sociology department of the Universidad de Chile. They will be presenting a comparative study of Argentina and Chile's popular politics trajectories since 2019 until the present. We will have the 4 presentations first, and we will leave like half an hour, 20 minutes for a Q&A at the end. I will encourage you to write down your questions and queries or comments on the chat box while you are hearing the speakers, and I will pick them up later. You can use either English or Spanish for the questions, and I will translate for the speakers when we open the mic, or then you will also be able to post your question by audio. This meeting is being recorded for the university, so if you don't wish to appear with your image in the recording, you can also use the chat and post your question there, so you won't be recorded by the camera. Before we start, I would like to draw your attention on a publication of the Latin American Bureau. Latin American Bureau is a non-profit online and print publisher that posts and printed all stuff, content on Latin America. I will share on the chat more information so you can access the publications that I am talking about later. I think in one of the recent publications, there's a few works by Sam. So, well, you will be able to join us, Latin Bureau, with this link. So, I don't know, Gabriel is going to be our first speaker. Are you ready for the...
Yeah, let me just share my screen. Okay, so I was saying thank you so much to Micaela, to Richard, to Catherine, to all people that made this event possible. Also to people from CLACS, and so I really appreciate the invitation, and I think that it's going to be a great seminar. The presentation that I'm going to do is called Violence Dressed Up as Heroism, the Latin American Far Right as a Social Movement. So this is part, like a bigger research that I'm doing as part of my Newton International Fellow. So the project, you can see there the name of the project. And I started this research in a first moment to assess in a commission of the Senate of Chile that wanted to study the role of visual images in the political radicalization. And after I expanded the research in other Latin American countries, so this presentation analyzed a series of mimetic images that represent the heroism of the different leaders of the so-called Latin American far right. and specifically the main supporters of the first Latin American Conservative Conference. That was a specific event where we could see like different emerging leaders from the far right assisting. So mainly Cast from Chile, Vizcarra in Peru, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Abdo in Paraguay, Áñez in Bolivia, Milei in Argentina, and Duque in Colombia. And through this analysis, I will show that the mimetic hero in the Latin American far right will be characterized by receiving a divine call to save the society, and in his journey, a series of common symbols will be evident. Strength and violent masculinity as forms of action and confrontation against evil, militarism as an ethical and aesthetic element in the organization of the hero's ethos, shine as an expression of differentiation, diverse cinematographic and pop symbols of appeal and relationship with historical superheroes, and the presence of humor as a form of deshumanization of the political victims. So these elements, as I will discuss in the presentation, have become structural components of the performativity with which the far right is articulating itself as an online and offline social movement, as we are discussing today. So in terms of historical evolution, this research can also collaborate to show how social movements have changed as new technologies have profoundly transformed the various manifestations of political action. Fake news, deep fakes, misinformation, disinformation. We have spoken about these concepts here in the Institute the last days. So I hope that through this presentation, we can articulate all these concepts with one of the main emerging forms of political communication, that is the mimetic communication. I would like to remember that 80% of fake news that we receive are transmitted through images. So this is one of the main values that we can see in this research, and also as a tool that is changing fast through different forms of generative artificial intelligence. That is a term that we are hearing a lot these times. So how I'm going to present this. First of all, I will speak about the post-colonial far right and mimetic communication, putting it in relation. I will just speak a little about what are memes, the methodology of the research. This is just a short research as part of this bigger research that I was explaining. Some of the main results and just short conclusions, as we don't have so much time. So about the post-colonial far right and mimetic communication. What can we say about this? We have like different expressions as Bukele in El Salvador, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Milei in Argentina. They are just a few of the paradigmatic cases which represent in different levels the rise of populism, the advances of right-wing radicalism, and the resurgence of extreme nationalists in Latin America. There are various debates on how to classify these emerging authoritarian leaders. Some people call them as Bonapartists, Caesarists, alt-right, ultra-right, extreme right, far right, and most controversially, fascist. However, in my research, I choose to use the term right-wing populism to refer, as some Latin Americanists indicate, not only to the ideological conservative elements and national populist influences, mainly this idea of construction of political antagonists that is so clear, but principally to the explicit praise and support of the local capitalist system. So the cohesive element at the regional level is the post-colonial historical situation and the militarization of the civilian sphere. So Latin America's colonial roots engendered a profoundly hierarchical society whose dominant classes have felt threatened by a series of recent rights advances on the part of the most vulnerable groups, responding in reactionary terms: militarizations of states, post-war, such as El Salvador and Guatemala, and or post-dictatorship situations as Brazil and Argentina. These relations determine today the close relations between political leaders and military forces. So this sociopolitical context of polarization and global transformation could not be explained without the study of the mimetic communication today. So, to say this, what are memes? Here you can see some images, and as I have argued in my work on right-wing populism, the political forces of the so-called international right-wing populism use a simple and polarized discursive strategy. So actors and social forces are divided into good and bad, exaggerating the importance of the opposite and denying any semantic space between the polarized categories. As Professor Charles Burdett here in the Institute argues, the construction of antagonists based on images was also characteristic of the period of the 20th century fascism. So this is not something new, and we just have changed the format. The most common type of internet meme consists of an image accompanied by text, generally inducing humorous responses in its recipients. So it is a type of humor that various authors refer to as multimodal and complex. Memes operate through short, synthetic, simple, and evaluative sentences with a mobilizing function. So from all the forms that the memetic communication and format can have, like we can speak about memes through TikTok videos, fixed images, and different ways to express them. I will focus now on the memes that represents the heroicity of these far-right leaders. So what we have here, we are going to speak about the methodology, but we can see here a map of Marvel versus DC. We are going to speak about the memes that I mean, like we have extracted the memes that we're going to study from the main websites that allow users to produce, share, and distribute memes. That are Pinterest, MemeDroid, Reddit, Know Your Meme, Cheeseburger, and MemeBase. They represent mainly all the figures of Marvel and DC that hegemonized the popular culture from the last century as part of an American golden age. So against the communist and expanding American values with high impact in Latin America, as nowadays this part of the construction of this pop culture is made using these American values. So we can see, yeah, in this map, how is distributed around the world the main leaders of DC and Marvel, two main companies that have like the oligopoly of the creators of heroicity through pop culture. And here we can see in each country who is the most loved character. So the analysis that I did is composed of two parts. So one is the detection of the connotative dimensions that are related to the legitimation of violence, and the second, the synthesis of the main categories found in the memes studied according to the grand theory methodology that I have already used in previous analysis. So in this way, we analyze the significance of the heroicity of 48 memes from the electoral campaigns in Latin America. So main results. I'm going to speak about the different categories that we have analyzed and detected. The elements detected in these 48 images are often common and transversal among the different images. So the memetic hero of the Latin American far right displays the following characteristics sorted by frequency. So the first is this one, divinization. Divinization was present in the 42% of the images that we analyzed. Here you can see Superman, Duque, Bolsonaro, Macri, and Abdo as Superman. The superhero is a character who possesses extraordinary or supernatural power. The characters are presented as figures with forms of supernatural power to rid their societies of the misfortunes they point to. And this is a kind of heroism constructed on the basis of a relation of affection through the miracle, veneration, and the test to be overcome. So the characters represent a type of narrative. Political leaders receive a divine call to fight against evil. So this call justifies violence if necessary. This is the first category of the four that we have detected. So glitter of celebrity, you can find the glitter of celebrity. I did like two different images here, but glitter of celebrity, here we can see Bolsonarist, Bloc, and Vizcarra all together. And this is an important element as the leaders are represented as celebrities in a fusion that reincarnates them in the fictional character. So the construction of these heroes as celebrity figures also involves fame, glitter, and shine. So the images suggest that the transformation of these political leaders into celebrities takes place through two mechanisms, through bodily fusion into comic book heroes who have previously acquired fame, and through violent eccentricity. So this is a very important element, as the leaders in such fashion appropriate objects that represent the punitive logic they advocate, such as fists, weapons, shields, and armors, and all of these legitimize the violence that is the main point of the presentation. Yeah, we can see different images about this idea, as we can see here also, like we can see, for example, Jose Antonio Cast using his shield in the reality. So there is like a huge connection between these digital elements and after how are represented at the public sphere offline. So this element was presented in the 63% of the images, and through their body, the images show a corporality with direct links to masculinity that emphasizes physical strength, readiness for confrontation, and the use of power. So corporality and aggressive manhood are vehicles that make it possible to identify these actors with this particular heroism. The parameters of force that represent this form of heroism are physical force, authoritarian force, and symbolic force. So the political project of the Latin American far right is structured around militarism. As you can see in these images, the military's organization and support understood not only in terms of armed and military symbolism, but also in terms of the hierarchical structure of the construction of the Latin American social order. So the militarized hero will be in charge of transmitting a rhetoric of defense to the punitive repressive principle of conflict resolution against the enemy, this dichotomy that I was speaking about. So the last one is the humor as a way of deshumanization of the enemy. So it was present in 20% of the images that we analyzed it. And for this, is important to understand the idea of the grotesque. So they deshumanize through animalization, use of hygienist, antibacterial discourse through humor. This is like the main language that they use to codify the idea of the enemy. So now we find visual elements that highlight exaggeration and ridicule as self-recognition of imperfections. What that means? That sometimes the hero can be imperfect, and in part of this imperfection can also construct a way of charismatic leader. So just to conclude, some conclusions that I have here. Well, first of all, I was trying, well, I think that I'm not going to show this because how much time we have?
We have like 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes. If we can see here, I'm going to try to see if it's possible to see, for example, this is the case of Milei in Argentina. We can see here dress it up as a kind of hero. Of course, you can see these kind of imperfections that we were speaking about, but we can, mainly understand how this construction, this bridge between offline and online, and specifically when we're speaking about far-right social movements, is made in our era. So there is here a video about him with that I'm not sure if I have enough internet to share. I will try. Well, maybe it's not possible to hear him. I'm not sure. Actually, just seeing the movements that he has is enough. He's just speaking about a kind of an anarcho-capitalist system that should be constructed, and I think that using this clauses, he is able to normalize a kind of discourse that in other kind of space of scenario it will be impossible. So coming back just to the conclusions, let me just check how was I here. Okay, the presentation here. You can see Pippi the frog here. So with the video that we saw, we can see just a small representation of how online fantasy is affecting offline political organization. And nowadays, just to finish, the sample of memes that we are analyzing in our research is trying to be bigger. So we are introducing quantitative techniques that allow us to compare elements on a large scale in order to ensure that they are reproduced with a high margin of fidelity. So I think that the point that I'm going to say is important to understand this idea. The images that we saw collaborate in the consolidation of these political figures as a powerful antidepressant capable of resolving individual affective symptoms and constructing new collective ones. This is an idea of Arlie Hochschild, and this is the idea that these images have this power as an antidepressant. Heroes offer in their adventurous journey a cure against ills. The hero as Superman integrates the sympathizer into a structure that reconciles the passivity of the sympathizer with the activity and the heroic overflow. So in this complementarity, the cure for illness emerges, and hero and sympathizer can establish a system of passages from one to the other, creating a coherence of the psychic narrative universe between the two, which allows the hero to embody traits of the sympathizer, as well as the sympathizers to embody the divine traits of the charismatic Superman. So this system of affectivities generates a concrete projection of the social universe, allowing the creation of desires and expectations, and these desires and expectations justify the use of violence by this salvationist and divine heroism. So despite having conducted some research on this area, there is still a long way to go in the study of how mimetic communication is determining political radicalization and polarization. So the construction of an enemy who is dehumanized is also reinforced with the construction of this masculine and heteronormative form of heroicity that far-right also represent in their political values. So our previous studies suggest that mimetic communication has been central in the victories of right-wing populist leaders, especially in Latin America. So in this region, the post-colonial condition implies that elements on the right-wing populism, such as authoritarianism, militarism, and racism, are encoded through particular communicative forms. So I would like to finish highlighting how codes such as humor, irony, and heroism camouflage violence, an approach that is under-researched in studies focusing in the quality of democracy. So thank you so much. Gracias, obrigado. And I'm really looking forward to listen to your presentations. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gabriel, for that very interesting take on the far right. The next one is going to be Lilia.
I just want to check if anyone can hear me.
Yeah. Yeah, they can hear you.
Perfect. And just a moment while I share my screen. Okay. Perfect. Right. Well, thank you very much for having me here today. So I've been invited to speak about my PhD that didn't necessarily link to the social movements explicitly, because I analyzed the right to effective public participation for minorities and the way it was implemented in Estonia and Latvia. So my PhD was primarily within international law and international relations. However, during the course of my research, I obviously encountered a lot of activities in terms of social movements in Estonia and Latvia, which I would like to reflect here today. So in terms of the outline for this presentation, I'm just going to talk about the cases of Estonia and Latvia, so set out the context. Also, I will discuss a little bit about the need for a new approach to position minorities within those contexts. And I will reflect on internal and external developments that took place in both states. And also I will highlight some of the identified challenges for the minority activists and elites based on the fieldwork that I conducted in 2018 and 2019. But also I will highlight some perspectives of minority activists and elites that offer some recommendations and the necessary changes that they see that they would like to implement. And also I will just conclude. So here's a map of Europe, and I highlighted where Estonia and Latvia are positioned. So you can see that those countries are not necessarily big, and the total population of those two states doesn't reach over 4 million. nonetheless, the contexts are very important, very unique. So if we would look into the historical dynamics, we would see that until the interwar period, so the period between the First World War and World War II, the two states were divided and quite among the attention of different imperial powers, so namely German, Swedish, Russian imperial powers. Then we see the interwar period establishing the first period of independence, so starting from 1920 and until 1939. And then with the first period of independence, it was ended by the Soviet rule in 1940, with the Russian language being the main lingua franca of the Union, so the working language of the Soviet Union. And then in 1991, you see the regained period of independence that led the two states to join different international organizations associated with democratic values and liberal order, so namely the European Union and also NATO. So my question within the thesis was, well, how can we position minorities here? And it turns out, if we talk about the same points here, so if we reflect on the period before the interwar period of first established independence, you can see that minorities already were present in the two states, and also some of the ethnic majorities were in a privileged position and actually ruling over the majorities of ethnic Estonians and Latvians, namely the Baltic Germans. But also, upon establishing the first period of independence, you see that the two states decided to follow a liberal multiculturalist model. So the writings of Zurcher in 1933 really highlight the unique approach to minority accommodation policies, for example, through non-territorial autonomy, so essentially decentralization of certain areas that would relate to minorities' way of life. Also, minority language education was provided, and there are many more elements that were quite positive and unique. So the interwar period and the multicultural policies pretty much were limited with the rise of authoritarianism in 1939. And then if we go to the third point, with the start of the Soviet Union period in 1940, I highlighted that the Russian language was pretty much the working language of the Soviet Union. However, there were many different diversity management policies with the promotion of national languages and also ensuring different smaller minority languages were also included into the policies. The writings of Grenoble in 2003 really highlight that. And with the regained period of independence in 1991, you see that minority rights become really crucial to membership of Estonia and Latvia, both within the European Union with the Copenhagen criteria of 1993, which is still applicable, of ensuring minority rights, but also with the 1995 requirements stated in the study of NATO enlargement. So those are just some of the examples. So my question was, well, surely if we can see that minorities were quite present within this historical context, why is most of the scholarship positions minorities within security considerations and mostly in the post-1991 developments of the two states? Is there a way for a new approach that would identify also the agency and role of these minorities in the two states? I decided to focus on the Russian-speaking minority because, well, we know that minorities were present in the two territories, and we also know that the Russian or Russian-speaking minority wasn't necessarily the biggest minority, even during the interwar period, but by 1989, the Russian-speaking minority reached about 35% to 40% of the total population. Now, I want to really highlight that when we talk about Russian-speaking population, yes, we're talking about ethnic Russian as well, but also the different other nationalities that were part of the Soviet Union. So you have Belarusian and many other nationalities that spoke the language, so spoke Russian. So, and you can see from this table that if we talk about the ethnic Russian population, yes, in Estonia, it would amount to 25% and in Latvia to 27% under current estimates. But if we could factor in the spoken language, then that proportion significantly increases. Now, within the scholarship that I encountered during the course of my PhD, so most of the research in the 1990s positioned this minority within the security discourses, their identity, and also the alleged kin state interests. So in this case, this would be Russia. Towards the beginning of 2000s, we see that there's a rise of scholarship addressing the international organization question and the role in implementation of different minority policies. Then later on, you see that there's a shift to, in a way, include the domestic roles or the agency of domestic stakeholders, but not necessarily minorities themselves. So attention would be given to ethnic majority MPs and etc. Now, my research focus was, well, what are the views of the minority themselves? And do they have an agency? And where can we observe this? So one of the things that I've encountered was that there's a real lack of scholarship on the Forum of Nationalities that both started in Estonia and Latvia before the regained period of independence, where national minorities gathered in support of the independence and discussed the future vision of the two states, which questions the security discourse of the minority. But also, I've asked a participant during the course of my field work, and her reflections were that with the perestroika, there was a sense of euphoria with the initiation of the forums of nationalities, and there was significant support where many Democrats, liberals, and intelligentsia acted in support of the independence. However, this wasn't really followed up, and I will explain why. So at the same time, you have the Popular Front organizations, which were mostly composed of the ethnic majority populations, but they called upon minorities to join them and seek in support of the independence from the Soviet Union. But they also promised, for example, in the example of Latvia, that there would be granting of citizenship to all minorities, even the ones that migrated during the Soviet Union. And also there would be some insurance of cultural rights and etc. in the newly regained state. In Estonia, the case was similar, but also minorities were part of the Popular Front movements. And there was the same promise that minority rights would be ensured in the regained period of independence. So this questions again the security framework of the minority, but ultimately the Popular Fronts were faced with also the social movements, such as citizen committee and citizen congresses that became more popular among the population. And the key word here is citizen, because they facilitated more exclusive vision of citizenship, linking it back to the interwar period and declaration that the Soviet Union period was de facto an occupation, and proclaiming that there's a state continuation. What this resulted in immediately, that with the regained period of independence, a lot of, basically 1/3 of the population was allocated a temporary status of non-citizen, which needed to transition into acquiring citizenship of the two states through naturalization. This significantly also impeded on the political participation rights, like such as vote and being elected. But despite this limitation, so to say, there were some positive developments in the 1990s with social movements representing the Russian speakers and other minorities, facilitating several political developments, such as the creation of the Presidential Roundtable on National Minorities and amendments to include an effective process of establishing cultural autonomy bodies in Estonia. In Latvia, for example, there was a push by the social movements to create a presidential consultative council on national minorities and a consultative council on national minorities education questions. But you can see that these developments happened quite some time ago. And my question was to the participants, what do you think the challenges are today of how to facilitate any similar changes? What was reported is that the public sphere is not particularly accommodated to the minority language. So both states only officially recognize one language. with Russian language being declared as foreign. So there are still this temporary status holders, so the non-citizen status, where about 6% of the total population in Estonia still have it. They're able to vote in local elections, but not be elected. And 9.5% in Latvia hold this status, and they're not able to vote or stand a candidate in anything. But also what was reported in the interviews that I've conducted, that there was a loss of momentum for minority rights on an international level. So if before the security sphere of discussion kind of promoted the topic, now it is not the case. Then in the interviews, what was reported is that there's a politicization of the Russian-speaking identity, but also the division among the Russian-speaking community themselves. And that there's a lack of cooperation among the minority and other stakeholders that are seeking, for example, human rights promotion and social justice. But this doesn't mean that on the international level or external sphere, there aren't any developments. There's support for the Minority Safe Pack initiative at the European Union level, which is quite important. They continue to do advocacy, both domestically and internationally, so at the European Court of Human Rights and the UN Human Rights Committee. There is also participation in international forums, such as the United Nations Forum on Minority Issues. And while these forums are reported to be as ineffective by the participants themselves, they highlight that this is the only way, for example, to bring attention to the ongoing issues and facilitate some form of dialogue with their home states. But also what was reported is that the kin state interests, so in this example, Russia is ultimately harming any kind of domestic aspiration and activism. So if you look at the statements at the UN Forum on Minority Issues and Universal Periodic Review and many other forums, participants really question whether these views are genuine in a way, and in a way it contributes to further securitization of the minority. What they reported in their recommendations is that while there is a lack of faith in international organizations, the creation of external platforms such as forums to discuss these issues and voice their concerns is quite important. Also, the vision of integration potentially needs an amendment. For now, what was happening is integration, then participation instead of integration through participation. Also, a number of participants raised concerns that the multicultural interwar model of the two states is not really paid attention to in the regained period of independence, and also that the implementation of existing provisions that largely remain symbolic at this point, but more focus needs to be addressed to that. Also, practically, the majority expressed the wish of de-stereotyping the identity, and also that international organizations should prioritize minority rights implementation, because there are a lot of normative guidance and frameworks, but the real issue is implementation. So just to conclude, so we've discussed today the unique and challenging context of the two states, the new perspective that needs to produce a more inclusive analysis, but also the role of minorities that contributed to domestic developments and their engagement in international level. But there are challenges that are associated today, including with changing political context and alleged kin state activities. Also, the recommendations that the minority representatives themselves stated is that we need more international forums for discussion, consideration for more inclusive policies in domestic level, and implementation of existing normative frameworks, among other things. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lilia, very much for your presentation. So now Richard has the floor. Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. I'm sharing that, right? All right. Sorry, everyone. Trying to.
No problem.
That's fine. So, Richard, before you start, let's check that your sound is working.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Okay, I'm Richard Smith. I'm at the Universities of Liverpool and London, and I'm going to speak about the student resistance to the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. In particular, I'm going to talk about three student movements: the University Cultural Association, which is a confederation of artistic and cultural workshops at the University of Chile, the struggle for democratic student representation at that university, and then the opposition movement in Santiago secondary schools. In particular, I'm going to look at the origins and emergence of the movement, and then movement political party interactions. A little bit of context, which will be familiar to most, but in 1973 to 1990, Chile was under military dictatorship led by Pinochet. During that time, thousands of people were killed or disappeared, tens of thousands of people were imprisoned and tortured, and hundreds of thousands of people went into exile. National, local governments suspended, press and media were censored, and bodies such as trade unions, student federations, neighborhood groups, and political party was banned. The idea was to stop any forms of popular assembly. During this time, the Roman Catholic and other churches played an important role in opposing the dictatorship. In the schools and universities, the military appointed university rectors and head teachers, politically active staff and students were expelled, and the long-standing student federations, FECH at the University of Chile and FESES for the Santiago secondary schools, were banned. And the long-standing traditional of democratic representation in schools and universities was replaced by a nominated representation. The military controlled the curricula and courses. In schools, they checked hair length, school uniform, and national anthems were sung. And there's a state security presence on campuses in schools. There's a network of sapos and isopolones, spies and informers. And the aim was to prevent any form of unsupervised popular gathering. For example, here at the University of Chile, this was Circular 63, was issued in October 1976 by the Vice Rector of Student Affairs. And this was an instruction to ban all unauthorized meetings. There was to be no student magazines or leaflets, no posters or pamphlets that alluded to university policies or to the military authorities. And all student, cultural, artistic, and sporting activities could only go through these official nominated student councils, the centre as the alumnus. And the aim was to maintain unconditional order and tranquility within the student body. An example here, what it felt like to be a student in the early 70s. This is a quote from a student who was at the economics department. I'll let you read his quote. Well, there's two quotes. So just imagine you're there in the student union. If you're there with maybe one friend, you're okay. But if two or three of you, the security staff would wander over to see what you were talking about, to see whether you're having an illicit conversation. So the aim was to atomize, to fragment the student body so it couldn't organize any opposition. And so the first rebellious act had to be to associate, to get together, to start to organize. So again, at the economics faculty, the first thing they tried to do was to use music to do that. So they decided they'd try and get a guitar inside the faculty. And the first week they tried it, they got the guitar to the university, but the guy who was going to bring the guitar in couldn't go through with it. But they tried again, and the next week they took a guitar to faculty, and they just started to sing. And lo and behold, security turned up. But they were singing very traditional songs, old ancient folklore songs, and the students loved it. And the guards thought there's no harm in this, so we'll let them get away with it. So they did it again the next Tuesday, and then the next Tuesday, and then it became every Tuesday. Then they had the foot in the door, so they sort of became the musical branch of the faculty. And because they were so out of tune, they couldn't really call themselves a musical group, so they called themselves the Experimental Music Workshop. And it didn't matter if you could sing or if you had an instrument, you could just bang. But it grew and it grew. So they got the foot in the door by just taking the guitar in, and then they grew it. In engineering faculty, there's another example here. So they took advantage of the fact that folk music in Chile does sort of have two faces. You had very, very political folk music associated with people like Victor Jara, who were very, very close to Salvador Allende and popular unity. Very political music, Quilapayún, Inti Illimani. But also, there's a very traditional strand of folk music that's much more associated with a nationalist culture. So there were groups on the university that focused on this more traditional music. And so we want to play music and you don't want folk songs, so we'll play the traditional folk music. And that was another reason for people to get together. So Jorge Rosas was an engineer at the time, and he led the engineering folk ensemble. He was also an activist with the Young Communists, as was Patricio Lanfranco, who led the efforts at the economics faculty. So Jorge convened other traditionalist groups, and they were staff groups and student groups, just to come together to play music. And they met in the engineering basement. And after doing that for a while, they decided to hold a folk music festival. So you've gone from just being permitted to play music to we're going to hold a festival. And it just grew and grew. So these two initiatives promoted other, or prompted, stimulated other workshops in music, theatre, poetry, art, across the different sites of the university, the different departments. And so they decided to do a song festival in 1977. Then in the university cultural presence, they broadened this to include poetry, theatre, and arts. And by 1978, they decided they weren't really just a folk music group. They called themselves the University Cultural Association. By 1980, they were doing their song festivals in a major theatre in the middle of Santiago, with thousands of people attending, not only from the University of Chile, not only from Santiago, but from further field as well. And this high profile, this was probably one of the first real mass movements were opposed to dictatorship, led to persecution, and students were banished. Patricio Lanfranco was arrested 5 times and maltreated by the authorities. And El Mercurio, the dictatorship's mouthpiece, used to equate the ACU with communist agitation. So let's look at the ACU and political parties. Jorge Rosas in engineering and Patricio Lanfranco of economics were both young communists at the time. Jorge was the first president of the ACU, Patricio was the second president of the ACU. Now, the young communists in the 70s, the leadership had been severely repressed. And so they had a grassroots policy to try and seek and create opportunities for mass movements. And they focused on 3 fronts: culture, sport, and student representation. And Jorge and Patricio were involved in the culture front of this. Jaime Insunza organized for the Communist Party in the education faculty at the university. He said, if we're playing football, it's an excuse for us to get together. We had a reason we were together. And in doing that, we could talk. And Carlos Contreras looked after school and university movement for the young communists. He was later killed by the authorities. But if we need a football to make people get together and start organizing, then football is a tool that we need to use. So the ACU started from initiatives by political activists, but outwardly it was an apolitical organization. It presented an apolitical face. No decisions about the ACU were made by political parties. There were no political discussions at ACU meetings. There might have been in the sidelines or in the corridors or in the toilets. Now, Patricio Lanfranco thinks maybe 10% of ACU members are also politically active. So the majority were there for the cultural program. And Mariana Gonzalez was the 4th president of the ACU. She said, I think political youth movements were involved, but they're involved as cultural entities and cultural activities. They had an influence, and many of the leaders were political militants, especially from the Communist Party. So the ACU ended in 1982. Why was that? So go back mid-1970s, the University of Chile, there's repression, expulsion, sackings, no right of assembly, no student councils, no student federation. What the ACU did was reclaim the right to assemble for art and culture. So it gave the students a socio-cultural development. They talked about being infantilized before, but what they wanted was a normal university life for students. They wanted the right to be young. And political activists would engage in the ACU as a cultural organization. Now, the student movement for democratic representation was suffering the ban of any sort of on-campus politics. But the ACU's cultural and artistic activities created the time and space needed for the cultural movement, the student movement, to reorganize itself and get involved. As it gained momentum, the ACU declined. And it's especially after the 1980s, really quite far-reaching reforms in higher education. Also, the founders of the ACU moved on. There was a natural student churn. But the focus of students who wanted to oppose the dictatorship became more the refoundation of the FETS than the ACU. I've gone too far. So let's look at student representation at the University of Chile. So before the coup, there's elected student councils, and after the coup, there was nominated student councils. The fetch was banned, and they set up a nominated federation. And the aim was to ban party politics from the campus. After a couple of years, because students weren't really engaging in a wholly nominated student representation, they conceded the election of year delegates. After that, it was a very managed process, but year delegates could be elected. And the student opposition used this little chink in the door to start the student movement. So what emerged alongside the nominated student councils emerged a series of participation committees, and they had different routes and different forms in the different schools and sites across the university. But they met openly. They were against the education reforms in 1980. They were for democracy and democratic student representation, and they're against authoritarianism and dictatorship. And they formed a loose network. But from these participation committees, they engaged in the student council processes in order to take them over. And one by one, they managed to take over the student councils, democratize them. And the nominated centres of the alumnus became democratic centres of the alumnus. When they controlled most of the 17 councils, the nominated Festech saw the writing on the wall, and students went on to, it dissolved itself, students went on to refound the Fetch. And these are some leaflets that were scattered by students during one of the protests. Let's now turn to the secondary schools. In parallel, they'd had democratic student council since 1949, and they had a student federation in Santiago. After the coup, school heads reported to a military official. They had nominated school councils. And in the first 10 years or so after the coup, organised opposition groups did emerge, but it largely emerged from separate social and cultural groups that are mainly organised by churches. And they tended to have a lifespan of 3 to 4 years because they dissolved as members left school. In the 1980s Chile, there were also education reforms to state education, not just higher education, but secondary and other education. And in 1983, national protest cycle began that lasted 3 years that provided great pressure towards the end of the dictatorship. And these stimulated the school students in Santiago to be more organised and to coordinate. And in state schools, democratic committees started to emerge that mirrored and influenced their centres, the alumnus, their student councils. And this is where party activists would get involved. Then in 1983, with the national protests, the democratic committees, the CODES actions, started to coordinate themselves within the zones of Santiago. So north, east, south, and central zones. And then those 4 zones started to coordinate across Santiago. Now, it does get a little bit alphabet soup, so I've done a nice diagram for you. So the CODES were in the schools, they organised across the different zones, and then COEM was the body that organised across Santiago. So they had many tactics, including mass marches, and the famously combative schools, the Liceo de Aplicación, was a few blocks away from the Alameda, which is the main thoroughfare through Santiago. And so students used to gather there, walk down the Alameda, past the Ministry of Education, past the Moreira Palace, which is where the Chilean presidents live, and they could get 500 to 800 marchers. They'd scatter pamphlets, miguelitos, which are welded together nails, and Molotov cocktails. And they were really well organised. They knew they could block an intersection for about 6 to 7 minutes. And after 7 minutes, the carabineros were likely to arrive. So they'd scatter. And they were just then school pupils in their uniforms in Santiago. But they'd reconvene at another intersection and do the same again. They ran demonstrations, school occupations. They put up street barricades, graffiti, banners, and leaflets. And all this was organised and coordinated across Santiago in weekly meetings of COEM. And they too refounded their student federation in 1986. Perhaps the most high-profile tactic they used was the school occupations, and they organised themselves in brigades. So the shop brigade went in first, opened the school gates and secured the building. The black brigade came in, took the roof and kept watch for the security forces. And the red secured the teacher's room and the school inspectors. Others would deal with tear gas grenades, they'd hand out leaflets, or they'd run the assembly, or they'd be there to make up numbers and to sing and to play guitar. The highest profile was perhaps the Liceo Adose, which resulted in the education minister resigning. After that occupation, 315 students were arrested, 14 from the school itself. So sometimes the model was that students from outside of school would come and occupy a school. The Lycée d'Application, for example, used to do self-occupations. So we look at these three movements in terms of the verticality and horizontality of their organization. So we're looking at whether a flat, open democratic structure, or are they top-down and hierarchical. And so under popular unity, there were experiments in popular democracy. That was all ended by a very vertical dictatorship. So the idea is broad-based social movements versus very disciplined political parties. And the military's vertical imposition of control over schools and universities seemed to have triggered horizontal responses by the students. So the ACU and its workshops, everyone who talks about the workshops and the ACU talked about discussion, consensus, and participation. The participation committees were described as being open, democratic, discursive, inclusive, as were the CODES and the zonal bodies and COEM. And they thought they were successful because they did that consensus building and agreement building. And they had this great experience of participation in assembly. And these were mass assemblies during dictatorship, so huge risks they were taking. But by taking that risk and getting joint decisions, they were able to coordinate very effectively. So there's a conscious adoption of open democratic structures. This was a rejection of military rule. It was a homage to popular unity, but it also epitomized and personified the goal of the movements and the members of it. They wanted people to govern themselves. So party activists worked within the flat, open structures. The repressed parties themselves were organized as very tight, secure cells. They had to be for security reasons. They were vertical, they're hierarchical, and they were disciplined. They just needed to be secure. But there were then public and clandestine militants. The public militants would speak openly and act openly, like Hawke and Patricia, but they often knew very little about the structures of their parties. And the clandestine militants functioned within the cells and weren't open about their politics. Being well organized, political activists could be very influential. They brought intelligence, coordination, experience of leadership, strategy, tactics, and discipline. And one school student said to me that the movement's contribution to national protest was managed through the COEM, but that the Juventudes, the political youth movements, managed the COEM. So denied the opportunity to organize openly, the underground party activists operated at this intersection of contrary spaces. You had a horizontal social organization and a disciplined clandestine party cell. The public leaders could influence tactics and strategy in open debate. The clandestine leaders leveraged the resources of the parties. But the students never demonstrated as an organization or a party. They always demonstrated together as schools or as universities. And hierarchies can be very good at mobilization and discipline, but decentralized organizations can be radical and innovative. And we had elements of both in the three student movements we've looked at today. The verticality gave expertise, resources, and focus, and the horizontality gave critical mass, safety in numbers, and democratic credibility. And that, I think, is all I'd like to say. I really like to thank my interviewees. The interviews were mainly done in 2019 in Santiago and the rest of Chile, and some of the archives, especially the archive of the Student Federation of the University of Chile. And I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. And so far, everybody has been very disciplined with the time. And so we have our last presentation by Sam Halvorsen and Nicolás Angelcos. And I think
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good. Let me try and share content. I think, do I need to be made the host? Perhaps.
Let me see. Sorry.
To share my screen, if that works.
Yes. Just give me 1 second. I thought I already did. Sorry. There you are.
Okie dokie, let me try. So let me do screen and see if I can pull up. Okie dokie. Now, can you see my screen?
Yes.
And can you hear me okay? Because I've got my headphones. I was a bit confused with the sound because we're in a room here, I'm online. So thanks a lot to Micaela for inviting us. Fantastic event and very timely and interesting. So I'm presenting a paper together with my co-author who's joining us on Zoom from Universidad de Chile, Nicolás and Angelcos, and it's very much a draft paper. So welcome comments. We're still working on it remotely between our two countries, but we thought it'd be a good opportunity to share our thinking so far, and it draws on our research, my own in Argentina, particularly in Buenos Aires, and Nicolás's continuing the theme of the last paper from Chile, and in particularly in Santiago. And I guess the starting point then, which I think is partly in spirit with today's seminar, is working backwards to make sense of where we are today. And this paper is, without trying to promise too much because we haven't quite done it yet, there's an attempt to be something of a conjunctural analysis of where we're at, where we find ourselves today, which is a difficult, we could say fascinating, but challenging moment when we think about where we are in the region, but specifically in the context of these two countries that we'll be talking about. And particularly when we kind of start from just thinking of the transformations that I imagine we're all very familiar with in the last 4 years. And the context of this paper is thinking through the conjuncture from and through popular politics, which I'll come back to in a minute. But if we start from 2019, when there was an eruption and or victory of popular politics. So I think in Argentina, a return to some form of, and I'll come back to, national popular politics, a victory following 4 years of the neoliberal rule under President Mauricio Macri. And then, of course, in Chile, an eruption of popular protest and politics in the street, both in a sense promising to a certain extent moments for popular politics in those countries and in the region. And then we find ourselves today in a very different conjuncture in which the right is returning to power in Argentina, or looks like it's most likely to be returning to the presidential elections and a majority in Congress in Argentina later this year. And of course, just a few days ago in Chile, we've seen the consolidation of, I think, what's often termed a kind of far right, populist right here under CAS. So really kind of throwing into disarray the kind of popular moment of hope in politics that we saw just 4 years ago. Now, we're trying to kind of make sense of how can it be that these things fell apart. Of course, we're not the only people doing such an analysis. And, I think lots of colleagues and people here are making sense of it. We try and do this by thinking through the significance of popular politics, and in particularly, and this is really my fault, being the geographer in our team and the geographer in the room, by trying to spatialize popular politics and think through some of the spatialities of popular politics in Argentina and Chile over recent decades and in recent years, drawing on our kind of field work to unravel what's been going on more broadly. So the paper in progress argues that it's the spatialities of popular politics in these two countries and perhaps elsewhere that might provide us some insights into some of the strategic opportunities, but particularly dilemmas that are being faced by the left in the region that are perhaps downplayed by other analyses that point out quite rightly the kind of economic global conjuncture into post-crisis, thinking about resources, thinking about China and so on. And what we try and do is pay attention to how popular politics has been spatially articulated, starting off, and this is of course only one paper, so there's only a limit to what we can do, but a bit after what we heard from Richard, so since the return of democracy. And the kind of main narrative in this kind of spatialization of popular politics, which is the kind of trigger for our interest in this paper, and goes back to the image I showed a minute ago, is the way in which in Argentina popular politics has been so firmly welded to national imaginaries, practices and strategies of political articulation, whereas Chile, it's been very firmly interchangeable with identities and mobilizations of low-income neighborhoods and barrios. Now, clearly, in both cases, there's a much broader set of articulations of popular politics going on across different scales and relations. But our starting point is to think through the ways in which popular politics isn't only determined by questions of class in an intersection with other dimensions, gender, indigeneity, and so on, but how spatiality then plays an active role in shaping what is and isn't possible politically in these contexts. So the paper itself draws on, and I want to try and keep this paper short, so we're not really going to go into much detail, but obviously we'd be really happy to discuss. It draws on our own field work, which is more ethnographic. So, we come in from a very particular micro context to try and think more relationally, conjuncturally. And in the paper, I draw on my own recent work in a small informal settlement, so a villa, favela, in northern edge of Buenos Aires. And in Santiago, Nicolás draws on his more long-standing work in a larger low-income neighborhood, Bajos de Mena, situated in the southwest of the region. So we are kind of resting on more ethnographic work, but we try and fold that in to this kind of bigger understanding of what's going on today. So our starting point for popular politics then, and this is maybe a question that I'd be interested to ask others today, what you understand by lo popular, política popular, popular politics. But our starting point is that it's more than simply saying working class, yeah? That popular politics provides a quite diverse, multiple, uneven terrain of grassroots politics, bound up with post-colonial nation states, and clearly, depending on where you are in the region, there's different weight given to questions of indigenous, Afro-descendant, and so on movements, and spans both kind of civil and political society. So they're both the horizontal and the vertical, if you like. Across the 20th century, there's obviously been a huge amount of studies into this. I think two central foci have been labor movements, to think about popular politics, and then the poor people's politics. And, across that, there's been a lot of work that's charted, on the one hand, the kind of waves of incorporation, but particularly the kind of early to mid 20th century incorporation of popular sectors within the states and welfare systems. But in parallel to that, kind of rapid urbanization, which in turn created new, if you like, popular demands and popular subjects. Those processes being particularly important in Chile and Argentina. And what we zoom in from that, and again, without much time to really go into it in that much depth, is the way in which we see emerging out of that the significance of barrios populares and the politics and subjects of the pobladores in Chile, with increasingly, as I'll come back to briefly, weak or irregular linkage to institutionalized and national party systems. And then in Argentina, a longer, although albeit uneven trajectory of building popular politics through a national popular imaginary, most recently dominated by the sphere known as Kirchnerism, all right? So coming out of Peronism. So clearly then, our starting point is that these spatial ideas, imaginaries and practices centered around the barrio, pobladores, and the Movimiento Nacional y Popular are central to some of the strategies which have been deployed for popular politics. But we also think that they contain and reproduce certain tensions and contradictions which might help us to start to unpack one of the dimensions through which we find the kind of progressive sectors in crisis today. So there is, a body of empirical work across the region that I think looks at these forms of popular politics, which often rests on certain theoretical ideas, very briefly here. And I think these are two tendencies we see in different extents across the region. So on the one hand, this kind of urban popular movement-based idea of popular politics rooted in particularly sort of land invasions and then attempts to build political organization from that. And often here a strong focus on questions of autonomy, of the agency of actors within civil society. Scholars such as Manuel Castells talking about urban social movements being quite influential, especially in the Chilean context. And then on the other hand, we've got an attempt to think through national popular mobilizations, coming from a tradition of kind of Gramscian thought, thinking about ideas and traditions of populism as a strategy for building collective wills that exceed local particularities. So the well-known work of Ernesto Laclau being kind of one of these. And from this, we're trying to unpack and take seriously these kind of spatial dimensions, again, to try and think through what that might mean for the kind of dilemmas currently present in the regions. So in the paper, we start from these particular neighborhoods and particular sites and case studies, which again, I won't attempt to do in any depth at all today, because they'll be more interested in getting onto the discussion. I think we've already been going for quite long. Very briefly though, just to give the kind of headlines, in Chile, we see during the 20th century, and we've heard, really useful in the last paper, a bit of the kind of antecedents for this. Popular politics being developed both in unions and neighborhoods, being aligned with left-wing political parties and Christian democracy. And then, and what we did here, particularly in the last paper, what was going on in the sort of early 80s, urban poor people as well playing a really important role in protests against the military dictatorship, participating in a range of different organizations to collectively confront the growing economic crisis. Now, crucially, for what we kind of start off with our more recent conjuncture analysis is how, since the return to democracy in 1990, centre-left parties, national parties shifted their strategies away from mass mobilization to engaging more in negotiations with the opposition and kind of inter-political party strategic maneuverings. So fast forwarding then to where we are today, to 18th of October 2019, the most significant urban revolt and popular uprising since the return to democracy in Chile, which opened up a process, as we're all aware, to amend the constitution inherited from the dictatorship, which is still in motion today. And the proposal, when put to the people, has faced widespread opposition from much of the popular sectors. And the process is really being led and dominated by negotiations within the political party sector, relatively de-linked and decoupled from much of the popular sectors, popular barrios. So in order to address their material challenges today, then urban poor people and popular sectors are deploying a variety of strategies. One of them is through trying to establish or responding to clientelistic relationships, particularly with local politicians who are installed through the municipality. There's also an attempt to organize more autonomously in opposition, sometimes all or any form of institutional politics. And the final is attempts to more institutionally build an urban movement of the pobladores, although often this is how they've had quite limited capacity for mobilization, coordination, particularly beyond the local scale or beyond the neighborhood. So popular politics in many ways in Chile has become synonymous with popular neighborhoods, with barrios populares, and has evolved with relative autonomy from more central, national, organized political institutions. Now, Argentina starts with a kind of similar tendency in that we see urban popular, i.e. poor politics, in the wake of a return to democracy, and particularly in the 1990s, taking on a very territorialized form, responding to the erosion of more traditional corporatist popular structures, trade unions, political parties, the welfare state. And famously in Argentina, urban peripheries generated intense new political subjectivities through growing resistance to neoliberal reform, very well documented in studies on the unemployed workers movement, and so on. And what gradually happened then is that these urban movements, urban peripheries, were reincorporated into popular politics via the initial recomposition of the Peronist party. So in the 1990s, people like Steve Levitsky have documented this quite well. But then in particular, following the arrival of the center-left Kirchner government from 2003, we saw them slowly form part of a newly hegemonic national popular movement that became revitalized, and then particularly under the presidency of Cristina Fernandez, and after around 2008, taking on a more left populist turn in a kind of Laclauian sense. my work, one of the different sites that I've been deploying this in, as I mentioned before, is in a small, what in the Chilean sense might be termed a popular neighborhood, a small informal settlement in the northern periphery of the city of Buenos Aires. Now, they attempted during the kind of 90s and early 2000s to develop their own forms, if you like, of popular autonomous organization at a time of kind of intense neoliberal reform, growing unemployment, and they really struggled to assert their own identity, their own leadership, their own capacity to negotiate. And things really didn't transform in this neighborhood until the year 2011, which was significant locally, because that was the year that a new local level council became institutionalized. And that provided a political opportunity for the national structures and political parties, particularly tied to Peronism and the Kirchner space, to then develop ties to that neighborhood, work with them. I don't think it shouldn't be caricatured as just a kind of top-down clientelist relationship. There was ongoing negotiations. And it's from that moment that the popular demands saw a resonance in institutional spaces, and they've slowly undergone a process of what we might term kind of slum upgrading. Here we can see a local councillor, part of the Evita movement, helping them install drinking water in the neighborhood. So in contrast to the Chilean context, it's the national popular movement which is hegemonic when we think about lo popular, popular politics in Argentina. And one of the tensions of this, which is something that I've been exploring elsewhere in other writings and is we kind of weave into this paper, is then what that means often in terms of displacing local concerns or local identities when the kind of national popular movement becomes hegemonic, which is often a particular problem in the Kirchner space, because they often fail to take seriously the weight of urban neighborhoods, particularly in the capital city of Buenos Aires. So there's much more we could say, but we'll leave it to discussions. And thankfully, I've got Nicolás who can talk about the Chilean side and can talk more about the Argentine side. But our main point is just to argue that popular politics in the region is both historically and geographically contingent. We've flagged these two kind of spatialities of the Nacional and the Barrio as being key sites, arenas, strategies, imaginaries for how popular politics unfolds. What we need to do, hopefully we'll do more in the paper, is unpack a bit about how and why they're mobilized to try and take seriously some of the tensions present today in these two movements. And the kind of headline is, in Chile, some of the historical failures to build linkages between national politics and popular barrios, which is really condensed in the Boric administration. And that historical failure have left them extraordinarily vulnerable, unable, with a lack of capacity to engage with the popular demands today. Whereas in Argentina, it's almost the opposite, that a lack of investment in more local neighborhood popular organizations and the hegemony of the national popular movement has often left it fragile when that national leadership enters into crisis, which it currently is at the moment. Now I'll leave it there and I'll stop sharing my screen if this lets me. There we go.
Thank you very much, Sam, for that presentation. I don't know if, Nicolás, you want to add something to that? Not for now. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all of the speakers for those very interesting ideas that you were throwing at us. Before, I have a few questions for the table, but before that, I want to see if somebody from the audience wants to ask something. You can do it through the chat box or raising your hand and opening your mic. I'll give you a few more minutes to find the courage. Okay, well, first, I just would like to address that it was very interesting for us when Richard and I were thinking about this discussion to have different approaches to social movements, which of course, and I think we succeeded into that. We have been talking about languages and minorities, and I was thinking about how both Sam and Nicolás' presentations and Lilia reflect on two very less or new explore dimensions of social movements. One, minorities and the influence of the external context, which, I mean, it's not new, but it has been sort of neglected over the years. And the proposition of Nicolás and Sam is also very interesting because they are bringing forward the idea of space. My first question to Lilia is, what do you think that makes, I mean, you talked about it, but it would be nice if you could reflect or expand a little bit more on what is that makes the Baltic states so different from other cases when regarding the action of minorities in pushing forward for legislation and achieving rights. To Richard, I would like to ask him is, what are the elements of Chile's experiences on the student movement or the youth movement that are present or can explain the difficulties that the present government and coalition is facing today? Because it's also maybe dialogues a little bit with what Nicolás and Sam were posing about how they weren't able to build a better connection with other sectors of society, popular or poor areas of society. To Gabriel, I would like to ask, you talked about how there's a strong narrative in the right-wing movement that is built on these images and this idea of heroism and so on, right? Is there also an aspirational component working in favor of these images to draw attention from not only from the right, but also from the undecisive sectors of the population to start looking at these options as some viable political options, mainly youth, I think, or if there are more targeted audiences or not by the right. And yeah, that's my for now. And also, no, sorry, to Sam and Nicolás, you already started to do some field work in both Chile and Argentina, right? In the case of Argentina and Chile, when you were talking about, in Argentina, when you were talking about there are these different strategies from people of varios aldeas, right? One was to become sort of more clientelistic, or it was clientelism or versus autonomy. Were those things that work? I mean, people from the neighborhoods are working like this in a strategically way, like choosing one or the other, or are these groups that are entering into tension with each other in each neighborhood? That's one question for now. And one question for all. Is the variable gender adds something to what or to your findings so far, or do you think it could add something to your findings or your work? So I know who wants to start. I don't know. Who wants to start? Lilia, do you want to start?
I'll be very quick. Thank you for that question. And I think, well, during my presentation, I discussed that the history of the two Baltic states is quite unique as well, but maybe I would like to go into another element, specifically the case of the Russian-speaking minority itself. I mean, if you think about it, it's pretty much the biggest minority that lives outside of the alleged kin state, Russia. So there are 20 million Russian speakers outside of Russia. And I think right now, even the identity of the Russian speakers themselves is just changing constantly with the context of the war in Ukraine. But also with the policies that were implemented in the two states, it does put to the test the so-called kind of democratic liberal order that we have, that of a promoting human rights, minority rights as well to an extent, but this is all changing. So this sets pretty much the new kind of benchmarks of what other states will have to fulfill upon joining, for example, the European Union and NATO. Or they might not. So again, this is constantly changing. The gender variable, I'm not sure, but this is something that I could reflect on in the future. So yeah, but that's a really good question. Thank you.
So I guess Gabriel Boric famously came from student politics, didn't he? And Sam referred to this lack of ability to build links with poblaciones. I think I saw that sort of idea with the people I spoke to. So during the earlier years of the dictatorship, they cleared a lot of the inner city poblaciones. So the poblaciones became much more peripheral. And what the students' movement I studied was we were able to bring the protests to the centre of the city. And those students that got involved in the Poblacion protests did so if they had personal contacts. So it wasn't any sort of organisational way they got involved. The way the university students supported the Poblacion movement was tend to be leveraged by the political youths and would be in terms of training and support and first aid and things like that during the day. So they get medical students to go down there and things like that. But the only way that the students themselves could get involved in the Poblacion politics was if they had a personal connection already. Otherwise, it was quite a closed. I think you've probably seen that with that's why Boric, he doesn't naturally have a constituency in the Poblaciones, which are quite peripheral. As for the gender question, the people I spoke to were very clear that they wanted women in position of leadership, and I was really lucky to speak to some very powerful female leaders of the secondary school movement, including one who's part of Boric's government today, Carolina Toja. Mm-hmm. So they were very clear that they wanted leadership to come from, it wanted to be a male movement.
No, not in this, sorry.
In
the 70s as well. That's very interesting.
Microphone off, and then I don't know if Nicolás may want to add something from Chilean case. I mean, there's we could start talking about clientelism. Maybe that will take us on a big tangent. I mean, I suppose the way I see clientelism in this case, and the way we've been looking at it in Buenos Aires, the moment writing about it is participatory clientelism. I think there's been a lot of literature on clientelism, which has very much moved beyond this caricature of a top-down material exchange and has built a much more relational and strategic understanding in which, clientelism may be good for democracy, may be bad for democracy. There's a lot of negotiation going on. It's not simply a manipulative action from above. I suppose the point here so this is a very small neighborhood. If you went to a larger villa in Buenos Aires, you'd see a different level of organization, but you would still see the same tendency. The same tendency being is that when popular demands are mobilized and have success, it relies on particularly certain political parties. In fact, it's not just the Peronists, because in parts of the city, the right-wing parties, the PRO also have a presence. The challenge is that they were not able to develop an autonomous political organization, which is something particular to the Argentine context, but also particular to the way in which, we can see the hegemonization of popular politics through this national popular imaginary. The way to talk about the popular is instinctively to associate yourself with that particular kind of national popular movement, which has been quite different in Chile, although we did flag some of and Nicolás perhaps will talk about the use of kind of certain clientelistic practices, which I think are much more rooted in local territorial networks. The case of Barrios Díaz, they're very much integrated into national political structures and movements. And within that, many of the leaders are women. the kind of the leader of the neighbours themselves. They don't have an elected structure yet. Who's coming to London next week in these events that have circulated is a woman. And of the political parties, 2 of the 3 main Peronist parties in the neighbourhood are led by women. There's an anthropological literature people have looked at in terms of women doing roles in informal settlements towards social reproduction, soup kitchens, and so on. In my research, I haven't yet added something new to that. I mean, we can see that pattern being reproduced there. I don't know if other people have kind of thoughts or comments about the role of gender within that. I don't know if Nicolás wants to add something, or yeah, I think he's going to say he can add something from the Chilean case. He might be speaking Spanish. I don't know if we need to interpret that or if we can just be multilingual.
I think, yeah, I can translate or some translate. So, Nicolás? Yeah, if you want to reply something, I can translate for you. Just you have to wait for some sentence to come up from me. If you give me just a few seconds, and I translate whatever you want to say. Just pause.
Okay.
Sorry. Nicolás, yo puedo traducir para vos. Lo único que necesito es que tal vez hagas frases un poco más cortas y hagas una pausa para que yo pueda traducir a inglés. ¿Te parece bien?
Sí, quisiera decir algo
Estás
muy...
muteado.
¿Sí?
No se te escucha, no sé.
A ver. No estoy muteado. ¿No me escuchan? ¿No?
Sí, escuchamos, sí.
¿Sí?
¿Sí?
Sí, se
Entonces,
escucha.
solo Micaela no me
Yo
escucha.
no lo escucho.
Yo escucho.
A ver.
Maybe you can translate some?
Ahí.
I can translate otherwise, if you can't hear him.
¿Sí?
Ok. A ver ahora, Nicolás, habla.
Sí, hola, Micaela.
Ahí está, ahí se te escucha.
Okay.
Okay. No, solo muy breve. Respecto a la pregunta por la dimensión de género en la política popular en Chile.
So, Nicolás is going to address the question about gender in popular politics in Chile.
Sí, lo primero que diría es que las mujeres populares entraron a la política durante la dictadura militar.
So the first thing I would say is that women enter politics during the dictatorship. Popular women, poor women enter politics during the dictatorship.
Claro, a través de su participación en organizaciones comunitarias orientadas a la sobrevivencia económica.
By participating in organizations oriented to communal organization.
Claro, y la relación con los partidos políticos generalmente estaba en manos de hombres de sectores populares, militantes de partidos políticos.
And the relationship with the political parties was between these women and men from political parties.
Claro, la principal diferencia en la actualidad es que las mujeres siguen siendo protagonistas en las organizaciones de barrio.
The principal difference between now and then is that women are protagonists in neighborhood organizations.
Claro, y que son ellas mismas las que establecen las relaciones con la política. No hay una mediación de otro tipo de dirigentes de partido o sindicatos.
And it's themselves, these women are making their own relationship between politics, and there is no intermediation between they and politics. Political, I mean party politics, you mean, partidos políticos.
Sí.
Okay, so there's no mediation between the women working and participating in social-based organizations and political parties. They are constructing this relationship themselves.
Claro, y en ese sentido, y con eso se termino, la política popular en Chile está altamente feminizada, si uno quisiera decirlo así.
And in that sense, Chile's politics are highly feminized.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I have another question about space, but I'm going to give the floor to Gabriel first.
En el chat también, claro, una pregunta.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. It was great, and a lot of nice and important ideas that we should articulate and put in contact. From my perspective, I'm here speaking more about the digital arena, this digital sphere that maybe can aggregate this value about when we are speaking about political movements nowadays in Latin America, how nowadays the social media is being like a central actor, a central tool in the way that social movements are constructed. So why I'm saying this, not just to put this like in communication with the other presentations, but also to answer to Micaela's question about the aspirational component that we can maybe find as another way to express the anger, the feelings, the ways that people are organized, but in other space. Of course, there is like this aspirational component that we can find not just in images, but also in all these cultural production that we can find in social networks. As I was concluding, we are speaking about that this kind of heroicity is an expression of how can we put in connection desires with people who are normally not representing these desires. So we speak about cure and illness and how those people can feel that they are ending with their illness being represented by those people. So in this case, for example, I think that you were speaking about some Laclaudian concepts and this idea when we speak, for example, in these terms of empty signifiers, or we are speaking, for example, in the case of these figures, about figures that accumulate different meanings. Like you can speak about masculinity, you can speak about militarization, you can speak about different values that are inside and let people to understand those figures in the direction that they prefer. So they accumulate different kind of aspirations that are actually different from another far-right figures because the colonial values or post-colonial values that we can find in the Latin American context. And in the case of gender, well, there are different ways that we can speak about this, but I think that mainly for our study, it's very important to understand how masculinity can represent these models of heroicity. So also to understand, for example, how the machism is introduced in the role of humor, and also to understand what values from far-right women can be understood. Sometimes people say, you know, it's weird to find women that are voting to far right to understand why are they doing this. So I think that from a gender perspective, we can try to understand this question and also try to study this more from an intersectional perspective. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So there's a question for all the speakers in the chat box. I'll just read it out loud and we'll make a round for it. The question is for Helia Lopez, I think. Are social movements per se devoid of ideology and act according to the pressures of the political, social, economic scenarios? Is this the reason why in Chile, for example, we are seeing far-right social movements with very popular bases? Richard is already nodding, so please go ahead.
I would speak for the movements I looked at. I spoke to people who were active on the left, and the left is famously fractious. But the people who spoke to me were clear that they were just opposition to Pinochet, and that kept them together. And you actually get similar when you talk to people involved in Chile solidarity campaigns at the same time, that all the sort of political divisions meant they just focused on solidarity at the same time. So in the movements I looked at, I think that was true.
I mean, just briefly, that obviously is a big question, which, I mean, if you think about popular spheres in politics and sectors, then I suppose it's the classic question of kind of Marxian question about, you know, class in itself, of itself, and so on, about what, you know, is there a tendency of working class towards being a revolutionary subject or not? But maybe just for me, a simple kind of empirical or, you know, analytical distinction is that when I think about social movements, I will make a distinction to thinking about popular politics and popular sectors. And a PhD student of mine is looking at the outcomes of 2019, and we've been having this ongoing discussion about, is it a social movement or not? My reading is that it's not a social movement, that maybe we could see a social movement emerge out of something like that, and that I see a social movement as having a particular internal identity and usually a demand. And then if we want from that, there may be a certain ideological tendency. So for me, my reading, but others, you know, Nicolás say something about Chile, is that there isn't really a movement that's come about for 2019, but there has been some kind of popular uprising, popular politics. In Argentina, is it very different? There have been social movements. There was in 2001, but the reason why they don't appear to be social movements, and in fact, I was discussing this with a colleague the other day in Buenos Aires, saying, do social movements exist in Buenos Aires? And our kind of response was, well, possibly no. And the reason they don't exist is, again, because of the hegemony of the national popular movement, which doesn't give space for good or for bad, without getting into a normative dimension, for what Castells would term an urban social movement to exist. They do exist, however, I think in Chile, and I know Nicolás, his work has looked at a lot of the pobladores movements that do have different ideologies and demands and so on.
Nicolás, do you want to add something?
Maybe. Yo creo que en el caso del estallido social, esta como gran movilización popular, uno podía observar una cierta identificación con un imaginario de izquierda.
Are you going to translate?
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, can you repeat it? Because I couldn't get your audio at first. Can you repeat?
It was saying that in the 2019 uprising that you could see a certain leftist imaginary.
Sí, pero al mismo tiempo eso convivía con un rechazo muy grande a los partidos políticos en general, incluyendo los de izquierda.
You want me to continue? Or?
Because if I do it will go with echo.
But that also went hand in hand with the general rejection of political parties, right?
Claro, a eso se suma que entre la primera elección para cambiar la Constitución y la última elección para aprobar el texto constitucional, pasamos de tener voto voluntario a voto obligatorio.
And just the fact that there's the shift, can't hear myself, between voluntary to obligatory vote in the elections for the Constitutional Assembly, is it? And then for approving the Constitution when it was written.
Claro, entonces en las primeras elecciones con voto voluntario ganó la izquierda, ganaron los partidos de izquierda. Sin embargo, en la elección final ha empezado a cobrar fuerza la extrema derecha, con voto obligatorio.
So the initial one, voluntary one, left kind of got majority in the Constitutional Assembly, whatever it's called, but by the time of the vote to accept the Constitution, which was obligatory, the right had kind of gained strength.
Claro, entonces, en el fondo, la pregunta que queda abierta es qué resonancia tenía ese movimiento entre la mayoría de la población chilena. Da la impresión que solamente aquellos que participaban activamente eran quienes se identificaban más con una alternativa de izquierda o de transformación.
So the question about what was the resonance of that uprising? The general population, I think what Nicolás is saying is that the people that more actively participated could be associated with the left. but not all those that voted for it when it was obligatory in the second round.
Thank you, Nicolás, and thank you, Sam, for translating. Lilia, do you want to add something? Do you want to react to the question?
Well, I suppose I can do briefly, because I think the example here is asking specifically about Chile, but that depends with the Baltic states. When are you asking this question? Because if in the kind of leading up to the independence period and slightly before, yes, there was an ideological preference leaning left among the minority, but then that diminished, especially with the restriction on Communist Party presence in national legislatures. So you won't find that party. But afterwards, what I saw is that there was a trend of highlighting the division among the social movements, if we want to call them that way, but also more linking to local and immediate problems that affect day-to-day lives. So that was pretty much the guidance. Yeah.
Thank you. So I had one more question about.
I also answer.
Oh, sorry, Gabriel, go ahead, please.
No, yes.
Sorry.
No. Can you hear me? Can you hear me or?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. No, I was just going to add that from the point of view of the values that we can see in the like public manifestations in the public sphere. A lot of the ideas that we see, of course, come from social media, and I would like to add the idea of how, for example, fake news and the simplification of ideas can be found, I'm sure that in Chile, but specifically more the case that I know more in Brazil or, for example, in Argentina. And I want to speak about the case of the sandwich de mortadela, or in Brazil, or choriperro, I think, or choripan in Argentina. So this is like a kind of, how can I explain? This is a kind of example of how far right that was not used to participate as a social movement cannot understand that people from the left are going to the streets without receiving any money or anything. So because they don't have the tradition of social as a social movement, they need to create this kind of conspirations or this kind of ideas that can to understand how it's possible that people can go to the street without receiving anything. So for example, in Brazil, one of the main sentences that people were used to say was I came for free. You know, I didn't receive a choriperro, I didn't receive a sandwich de mortadela, I didn't receive anything for coming here, as I am a real guy that is participating in this kind of new social movement. So I'm telling you this because I think that it's important to understand how new are those movements and how, as they are very new, they need to use these kind of ideas that for us doesn't have any sense, but are part of the construction of this kind of reality that can make sense for them. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that, and also for this clientelism and people trying not to be associated with that. It's yeah, it's something that's interesting there. Regarding this, I have a last question about space and the cases that you both, Nicolás and Sam, are studying. I do know that Barrios Aldeas is a very, in terms of geography, side of the city of Buenos Aires is kind of isolated. It's in an area which is not many people know that there's a neighborhood there. So my question is this idea of space and the disconnection between national and local politics goes in that direction or not. I mean, if this is one of the reasons why big national ideas and programs and politics cannot reach these sort of faraway places, because I'm also thinking if this is just the case for Buenos Aires, or you find that happens the same in small towns and slums, disenchantment of small poor neighborhoods also happens in Tucumán or Mendoza or Córdoba. And I cannot ask about Chile because I really don't know where the other case is, but maybe this also this can translate to the Chilean case.
Yeah, so I mean, just briefly, because there's so many things that could be said. I mean, you're right. It's a very small neighborhood. It's marginal in that it's tucked away in the richest neighborhood in the city. But what's interesting is that it today has 3 different Peronist parties with branches in it, and other political parties with an active presence. So even though it's so small, it's saturated with political parties and presence, which begs the question as to why. But without going too much down that route, I mean, I think what it demonstrates is similar things to elsewhere, which is the significance, the presence, the importance, the role of these national popular organizations in terms of linking the popular demands and politics into a broader set of demands. And I think that is something that we kind of see replicated elsewhere. In that sense, I don't think there is a huge difference, but there is kind of a particularly unique history to it, which is that they're demanding to have their own visibility and representation, which is different to the other informal settlements like Villa 31, which is one of the larger kind of shanty towns in the city that does have that. But in a sense, the argument of this paper, I don't think is impacted too much by the fact that it's small or not. The argument is about the significance, the way in which local politics, whether it be in Buenos Aires, in other work that I've done with a colleague in Argentina, we compared movements in the whole city of Buenos Aires and looked at also the movement of the Tupac in the northwest of the country, both quite big movements, big areas. But we saw the same thing in both cases, that the national popular movement was unable really to give weight to the local identities, which in the city of Buenos Aires is relatively middle class, with a tradition of more progressive left politics that doesn't fit always well with Peronism. And in the Northwest, there's quite a strong indigenous component, and that the national popular movement struggled to valorize those local identities because of the importance of the hegemony of the national popular Peronist movement, which then there's a whole historical discussion around how that's operated through the kind of Peronist sphere. Yeah, I don't know, as I say, it's a big question. I don't know if you wanted Nicolás to comment, or maybe others to discuss, or...
Nicolás, do you want to add something? We have a question from a colleague here that joined us here in the table.
No escuché también la pregunta porque había eco. Era ¿qué tan representativo en el fondo eran estos barrios? ¿Esa era la pregunta?
No tanto si eran representativos o no, sino si esta idea de la espacialidad, esta desconexión entre la política nacional y los barrios más pequeños, que suelen, como en el caso de Saldías, están muy aislados, se repiten en otros casos, digamos. Porque bueno, en el caso de Buenos Aires es un barrio bastante aislado dentro de la ciudad. La pregunta en el caso de Argentina era si se repetía en otras provincias, y no sé en Chile si pasa eso, si encontraban algo así también.
Sí, gracias. A diferencia de Saldías, yo no conozco Saldías, pero a diferencia de Saldías, Bajos de Mena, el barrio que yo trabajo para Chile, para la escala chilena, es enorme. O sea, es del porte de una ciudad intermedia en Chile, 140.000 habitantes. algo así.
So it's a much larger neighborhood. It's a huge urban neighborhood that Nicolás is using in our paper.
Claro. Ahora tiene una historia distinta a otros barrios populares en Chile, que fueron producto de la autoconstrucción y que estaban muy vinculados a la izquierda, tradicionalmente.
So it's different to other histories of popular neighborhoods that were all out self-constructed and more tied to a left historical trajectory.
Claro. Y el Estado, hoy día, actualmente, más del 70% de los pobres en la ciudad viven en barrios construidos por el Estado, parecidos a Bajos de Mena, en el fondo.
So the majority, more than 70% of people live in neighborhoods built by the states, like this one.
Ahora bien, yo creo que el alcance de mis resultados es a nivel metropolitano. Mi principal duda es con ciudades intermedias o ciudades más pequeñas que tienen un componente rural mucho más fuerte.
So he was saying that his kind of empirical results spread to kind of metropolitan urban scale, but there's a question about smaller to medium cities in a more rural context, how they would fit in.
Y de hecho, y con eso termino, por ejemplo, en los últimos resultados de la elección, donde ganó la extrema derecha, en la región metropolitana fue la única región donde no ganó, efectivamente. O sea, donde igual los sectores populares han desarrollado estrategias de diverso tipo, digamos.
So his is one of the few areas where the right didn't win majority in the recent election.
Okay. Thank you, Nicolás. It's almost 6, but we have one last question, if you bear with me, and we can hear the question of Pablo.
Okay, so this is for Sam and Nicolás. So it's I mean, I guess the short way of phrasing my question is, do you have already a sense of what is in crisis in those sites, as spatialized as they are? Is it following on Laclau, kind of populist movements are about the people, right? It's about the production of the people. And if I think you're adding to that the fact that this has a geography. But I was thinking as I listened to you guys on for instance, Clara Han ethnography of Chile, precarity, and how these shanty towns in Santiago were invaded by credit cards, and then the people mobilized their aspirations through credit, everyday credit, and then producing the way of life through credit was the way they became new citizens in Chile, for instance. So I was wondering what is actually in crisis in Buenos Aires, say, for instance, in the institutional organizations, and in Chile in the neighborhood organizations that is scaling up the crisis to another level. And also whether this is also a sign that it is the idea that the politics is, or the solution people is looking is in the state, for instance, or in the markets, or somewhere else, in organizations beyond the state, like say Raquel Gutierrez in Bolivia would describe, like against the state politics. So the short question is, what is the sense of crisis in those sites?
I'll try and be really brief, because obviously, and this kind of then touches on a more central question about what we're trying to do with the paper, which, as I say, is a work in progress. The starting point for the presentation was actually the kind of more macro, even regional sense of the left, if we want to call it, or the progressive sectors being in crisis, which is clear, right? In both in Argentina and in Chile, this right now, they're both in deep crisis, but potentially regionally as well, even though they're in power in most countries. And it was trying to, I think, start from that crisis to make sense of that. As I said at the beginning, I think people have been doing that partly through economic readings, partly through questions of, post-neoliberal development and the failures of it, of extractivist models and so on. And one of the things that we're trying to do is through this spatial reading, you know, if we're to take a more Laclauan route, because in this paper, and you know, still working on it, we haven't got necessarily, you know, we're still discussing, aren't we, Nicolás, a kind of common theoretical approach. We have these two different kind of miradas, perspectives. But if we take a kind of more Argentine Laclauan approach, then the failure would be one of articulation, but it's to spatialize articulation and think about that articulation in terms of, perhaps to go back to Micaela's point about how peripheries are brought in or not to the centers. And I think your point is very a good one for how maybe financially and economically that's been working out. And when we're looking at the upgrading of these informal settlements, there's a clear dimension that the right-wing government wants to bring them in, you know, to then privatize housing, to build roads so that capital can expand in the classic sense. Our interest has been more politically. And as we've discussed, you know, in Chile, there's been a historical failure to articulate that these ex-student leaders have got into power, and there hasn't been that long-term building. Whereas in Argentina, there has been a long-term build. I mean, in this neighborhood, the Peronist Party had been there since the late 1990s when they opened their first comedor. But that hasn't translated into what we might call more spatial articulation, in which the national popular movement appreciates the multiplicity of spaces, identities, subjectivities, and takes that kind of seriously more politically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I could talk for much longer, but it was a really obviously important question.
Well, it's already 6, so I have to wrap up for today. Thank you very much to our speakers, to CLACS, for the space, to the university. Hope you had enjoyed and are leaving with more questions and ideas to keep working on these very interesting issues. So thank you very much. That's it for today.